Welcome to the third installment of a reading of Madame Bovary. Now, where were we? Oh, okay. Up, here we go. Often, when Charles was out, she took from the cupboard, between the folds of the linen where she had left it, the green silk cigar case. She looked at it, opened it, and even smelled the odor of the lining. A mixture of verbena and tobacco. Whose was it? The Viscount's? Perhaps it was a present from his mistress. It had been embroidered on some rosewood frame. A pretty little thing, hidden from all eyes, that had occupied many hours, and over which had fallen the soft curls of the pensive worker. A breath of love had passed over the stitches on the canvas. Each prick of the needle had fixed there a hope or a memory, and all those interwoven threads of silk were but the continuity of the same silent passion. And then, one morning, the Viscount had taken it away with him. Of what had they spoken when it lay upon the white mantel chimneys, between flower vases and pompadour clocks? She was at Toast, he was at Paris now, far away. What was this Paris like? What a vague name. She repeated it in a low voice. For the mere pleasure of it, it rang in her ears like a great cathedral bell. It shone before her eyes, even on the labels of her pomade pots. At night, when the carriers passed under her windows in their carts singing the Marjolaine, she awoke and listened to the noise of the iron-bound wheels, which, as they gained the country road, was soon deadened by the soil. They will be there tomorrow, she said to herself, and she followed them in thought up and down the hills, traversing villages, gliding along the high roads by the light of the stars. At the end of some indefinite distance, there was always a confused spot into which her dream died. She bought a plan of Paris, and with the tip of her finger on the map, she walked about the capital. She went up the boulevards, stopping at every turning, between the lines of the streets, in front of the white squares that represented the houses. At last she would close the lids of her weary eyes, and see in the darkness the gas jets flaring in the wind and the steps of carriages lowered with much noise before the peristyles of theatres. She took in La Corbeille, a lady's journal, and the Sylphe de Salon. She devoured, without skipping a word, all the accounts of first nights, races, and soirees, took interest in the debut of a singer, in the opening of a new shop. She knew the latest fashion, the addresses of the best tailors, the days of the Bois and the opera. In Eugène Sue, she studied descriptions of furniture. She read Balzac and George Sand, seeking in them imaginary satisfaction for her own desires. Even at the table, she had a book by her and turned over the pages while Charles ate and talked to her. The memory of the Viscount always returned as she read. Between him and the imaginary personages, she made comparisons. But the circle of which he was the center gradually widened round him, and the aureole that he bore, fading from his form, broadened out beyond, lightening up her other dreams. Paris, more vague than the ocean, glimmered before Emma's eyes in an atmosphere of vermilion. The many lives that stirred amid this tumult were, however, divided into parts, classed as distinct pictures. Emma perceived only 2 or 3 that hid from her all the rest, and in themselves represented all humanity. The world of ambassadors moved over polished floors and drawing rooms lined with mirrors, round oval tables covered with velvet and gold-fringed cloths. There were dresses with trains, deep mysteries, anguish hidden beneath smiles. Then came the society of the duchesses. All were pale, all got up at 4 o'clock. The women, poor angels, wore English point on their petticoats. And the men, unappreciated geniuses, under a frivolous outward seeming, rode horses to death at pleasure parties, spent the summer season at Baden, and towards the 40s married heiresses. In the private rooms of restaurants where one sups after midnight by the light of wax candles, laughed the motley crew of men of letters and actresses. They were prodigal as kings, full of ideal, ambitious, fantastic frenzy. This was an exercise outside that of all others, between heaven and earth, in the midst of storms, having something of the sublime. For the rest of the world it was lost, with no particular place, and as if non-existent. The nearer things were, moreover, the more her thoughts turned away from them. All her immediate surroundings, the wearisome country, the middle-class imbeciles, the mediocrity of existence, seemed to her exceptional, a peculiar chance that had caught hold of her, while beyond stretched, as far as the eye could see, an immense land of joys and passions. She confused in her desire the sensualities of luxury with the delights of the heart, elegance of manners with delicacy of sentiment. Did not love, like Indian plants, need a special soil, a particular temperature? Signs by moonlight, long embraces, tears flowing over yielded hands, all the fevers of the flesh, and the languors of tenderness could not be separated from the balconies of great castles full of indolence, from boudoirs with silken curtains and thick carpets, well-filled flower stands, a bed on a raised dais, nor from the flashing of precious stones and the shoulder knots of liveries. The lad from the posting-house, who came to groom the mare every morning, passed through the passage with his heavy wooden shoes. There were holes in his blouse, his feet were bare in list slippers. And this was the groom in knee breeches with whom she had to be content. His work done, he did not come back again all day, for Charles, on his return, put up his horse himself, unsaddled him, and put on the halter, while the servant girl brought a bundle of straw and threw it as best she could into the manger. To replace Nastasie, who left toasts shedding torrents of tears, Emma took into her service a young girl of 14, an orphan with a sweet face. She forbade her wearing cotton caps, taught her to address her in the third person, to bring a glass of water on a plate, to knock before coming into the room, to iron, starch, and to dress her. Wanted to make a lady's maid of her. The new servant obeyed without a murmur, so as not to be sent away. And, as Madame usually left the key in the sideboard, Félicité every evening took a small supply of sugar that she ate alone in her bed after she had said her prayers. Sometimes in the afternoon she went to chat with the postilions. Madame was in her room upstairs. She wore an open dressing gown that showed between the shawl facings of her bodice a pleated chemisette with 3 gold buttons. Her belt was a corded girdle with great tassels, and her small garnet-colored slippers had a large knot of ribbon that fell over her instep. She had bought herself a blotting book, writing case, pen holder, and envelopes. Although she had no one to write to, she dusted her whatnot, looked at herself in the glass, picked up a book, and then, dreaming between the lines, let it drop on her knees. She longed to travel or to go back to her convent. She wished at the same time to die and to live in Paris. Charles, in snow and rain, trotted across country. He ate omelets on farmhouse tables, poked his arm into damp beds, received the tepid spurt of bloodlettings in his face, listened to death rattles, examined basins, turned over a good deal of dirty linen. But every evening he found a blazing fire, his dinner ready, easy chairs, and a well-dressed woman, charming with an odor of freshness, though no one could say whence the perfume came, or if it were not her skin that made odorous her chemise. Now it was some new way of arranging paper sconces for the candles, a flounce that she altered on her gown, or an extraordinary name for some very simple dish that the servant had spoiled, but that Charles swallowed with pleasure to the last mouthful. At Rouen, she saw some ladies who wore a bunch of charms on the watch chains. She bought some charms. She wanted for her mantelpiece 2 large blue glass vases, and some time after an ivory nécessaire with a silver gilt thimble. The less Charles understood these refinements, the more they seduced him. They added something to the pleasure of the senses and to the comfort of his fireside. It was like a golden dust sanding all along the narrow path of his life. He was well, looked well, his reputation was firmly established. The country folk loved him because he was not proud. He petted the children, never went to the public house, and, moreover, his morals inspired confidence. He was specially successful with catarrhs and chest complaints. Being much afraid of killing his patients, Charles, in fact, only prescribed sedatives. From time to time, an emetic, a foot bath, or leeches. It was not that he was afraid of surgery. He bled people copiously like horses, and for the taking out of teeth, he had the devil's own wrist. Finally, to keep up with the times, he took in La Ruche Médicale, a new journal whose prospectus had been sent to him. He read it a little after dinner, but in about 5 minutes the warmth of the room, added to the effect of his dinner, sent him to sleep. And he sat there, his chin on his 2 hands, and his hair spreading like a mane to the foot of the lamp. Emma looked at him and shrugged her shoulders. Why, at least, was not her husband one of those men of taciturn passions who work at their books all night, and at last, when about 60, the age of rheumatism sets in, wear a string of orders on their ill-fitting black coat? She could have wished this name of Bovary, which was hers, had been illustrious. To see it displayed at the booksellers, repeated in the newspapers, known to all France. But Charles had no ambition. An Yvetot doctor, whom he had lately met in consultation, had somewhat humiliated him at the very bedside of the patient before the assembled relatives. When in the evening Charles told her this anecdote, Emma inveighed loudly against his colleague. Charles was much touched. He kissed her forehead with a tear in his eyes. But she was angered with shame. She felt a wild desire to strike him. She went to open the window in the passage and breathed in the fresh air to calm herself. "What a man! What a man!" she said in a low voice, biting her lips. Besides, she was becoming more irritated with him. As he grew older, his manner grew heavier. At dessert, he cut the corks of the empty bottles. After eating, he cleaned his teeth with his tongue. In taking soup, he made a gurgling noise with every spoonful. And as he was getting fatter, the puffed-out cheeks seemed to push the eyes, always small, up to the temples. Sometimes Emma tucked the red borders of his undervest onto his waistcoat, rearranged his cravat, and threw away the dirty gloves he was going to put on. And this was not, as he fancied, for himself. It was for herself, by a diffusion of egotism, of nervous irritation. Sometimes, too, she told him of what she had read, such as a passage in a novel, of a new play, or an anecdote of the upper ten that she had seen in a feuilleton. For after all, Charles was something, an ever-open ear, an ever-ready approbation. She confided many a thing to her greyhound. She would have done so to the logs in the fireplace, or to the pendulum of the clock. At the bottom of her heart, however, she was waiting for something to happen. Like shipwrecked sailors, she turned despairing eyes upon the solitude of her life, seeking afar off some white sail in the mists of the horizon. She did not know what this chance would be, what wind would bring it her, towards what shore it would drive her, if it would be a shallop or a three-decker, laden with anguish or full of bliss to the portholes. But each morning as she awoke, she hoped it would come that day. She listened to every sound, sprang up with a start, wondered that it did not come. Then, at sunset, always more saddened, she longed for the morrow. Spring came round with the first warm weather. When the pear trees began to blossom, she suffered from dyspnea. From the beginning of July, she counted how many weeks there were to October, thinking that perhaps the Marquis d'Andrevilliers would give another ball at Vaubyessard. But all September passed without letters or visits. After the ennui of this disappointment, her heart once more remained empty, and then the same series of days recommenced. So now they would thus follow one another, always the same, immovable, and bringing nothing. Other lives, however flat, had at least the chance of some event. One adventure sometimes brought with it infinite consequences, and the scene changed. But nothing happened to her. God had willed it so. The future was a dark corridor, with its door at the end shut fast. She gave up music. What was the good of playing? Who would hear her? Since she could never, in a velvet gown with short sleeves, striking with her light fingers the ivory keys of the Erard at a concert, feel the murmur of ecstasy envelop her like a breeze, it was not worth while boring herself with practicing. Her drawing cardboard and her embroidery she left in the cupboard. What was the good? What was the good? Sewing irritated her. "I've read everything," she said to herself. and she sat there, making the tongs red hot, or looked at the rain falling. How sad she was on Sundays when the vespers sounded. She listened with dull attention to each stroke of the cracked bell. A cat slowly walked over some roof, put up his back in the pale rays of the sun. The wind on the high road blew up clouds of dust. Afar off, a dog sometimes howled, and the bell, keeping time, continued its monotonous ringing that died away over the fields. But the people came out from church. The women in waxed clogs, the peasants in new blouses, the little bare-headed children skipping along in front of them. All were going home. Until nightfall, 5 or 6 men, always the same, stayed playing at corks in front of the large door of the inn. The winter was severe. The windows every morning were covered with rime, and the light shining through them, dim as through ground glass, sometimes did not change the whole day long. At 4 o'clock, the lamp had to be lighted. On fine days, she went down into the garden. The dew had left on the cabbages a silver lace, with long, transparent threads spreading from one to the other. No birds were to be heard. Everything seemed asleep. The espalier covered with straw, and the vine like a great sick serpent under the coping of the wall, along which, on drawing near, one saw the many-footed woodlice crawling. Under the spruce by the hedgerow, the curé in the 3-cornered hat, reading his breviary, had lost his right foot, and the very plaster scaling off with the frost had left white scabs on his face. Then she went up again, shut her door, put on coals, and, fainting with the heat of the hearth, felt her boredom weigh more heavily than ever. She would have liked to go down and talk to the servant, but a sense of shame restrained her. Every day at the same time, the schoolmaster in a black skullcap opened the shutters of his house, and a rural policeman, wearing his sabre over his blouse, passed by. Night and morning, the post horses, 3 by 3, crossed the street to water at the pond. From time to time, the bell of a public house door rang, and when it was windy, one could hear the little brass basins that served as signs for the hairdresser's shop, creaking on their 2 rods. The shop had as decoration an old engraving of a fashion plate stuck against a window pane, and the wax bust of a woman with yellow hair. He, too, the hairdresser, lamented his wasted calling, his hopeless future, and dreaming of some shop in a big town. At Rouen, for example, overlooking the harbor, near the theater. He walked up and down all day from the Marais to the church, somber and waiting for customers. When Madame Bovary looked up, she always saw him there, like a sentinel on duty, with his scallop over his ears and his vest of lasting. Sometimes in the afternoon, outside the window of her room, the head of a man appeared, a swarthy head with black whiskers, smiling slowly with a broad, gentle smile that showed his white teeth. A waltz immediately began, and on the organ in a little drawing room, dances the size of a finger, women in pink turbans, Tyroleans in jackets, monkeys in frock coats, gentlemen in knee breeches, turned and turned between the sofas, the consoles, multiplied in the bits of looking-glass held together at their corners by a piece of golden paper. The man turned his handle, looking to the right and left, and up at the windows. Now and again, while he shot out a long squirt of brown saliva against the milestone, with his knee raised his instrument, whose hard straps tired his shoulder. And now, doleful and drawling, or gay and hurried, the music escaped from the box, droning through a curtain of pink taffeta, under a brass claw in arabesque. They were airs played in other places at the theatres, sung in drawing rooms, danced to a night under the lighted lustres, echoes of the world that reached even to Emma. Endless sarabands ran through her head, and like an Indian dancing girl on the flowers of a carpet, her thoughts leapt with the notes, swung from dream to dream, from sadness to sadness. When the man had caught some coppers in his cap, he drew down an old cover of blue cloth, hitched his organ on to his back, and went off with a heavy tread. She watched him going. But it was above all the meal times that were unbearable to her. In this small room on the ground floor, with its smoking stove, its creaking door, the walls that sweated, the damp flags, all the bitterness in life seemed served up on her plate, and the smoke of the boiled beef there rose from her secret soul whiffs of sickliness. Charles was a slow eater. She played with a few nuts, or, leaning on her elbow, amused herself with drawing lines along the oilcloth table cover with the point of her knife. She now let everything in her household take care of itself, and Madame Bovary Senior, when she came to spend part of Lent at Toast, was much surprised at the change. She, who was formerly so careful, so dainty, now passed whole days without dressing, wore grey cotton stockings, and burned tallow candles. She kept saying they must be economical since they were not rich, adding that she was very content, very happy, that Toast pleased her very much, with other speeches that closed the mouth of her mother-in-law. Besides, Emma no longer seemed inclined to follow her advice. Once even, Madame Bovary, having thought fit to maintain that mistresses ought to keep an eye on the religion of their servants, she had answered with so angry a look and so cold a smile that the good woman did not interfere again. Emma was growing difficult, capricious. She ordered dishes for herself, then she did not touch them. One day drank only pure milk, the next cups of tea by the dozen. Often she persisted in not going out, then, stifling, threw open the windows and put on light dresses. After she had well scolded the servant, she made her presents, or sent her out to see neighbors, just as she sometimes threw beggars all the silver in her purse. Although she was by no means tender-hearted or easily accessible to the feelings of others, like most country-bred people, who always retain in their souls something of the horny hardness of the paternal hands. Towards the end of February, old Rouault, in memory of his cure, himself brought his son-in-law a superb turkey and stayed 3 days at Toast. Charles, being with his patients, Emma kept him company. He smoked in the room, spat on the fire dogs, talked farming, calves, cows, poultry, and municipal council, so that when he left, she closed the door on him with a feeling of satisfaction that surprised even herself. Moreover, she no longer concealed her contempt for anything or anybody, and at times she set herself to express singular opinions, finding fault with that which others approved, and approving things perverse and immoral, all of which made her husband open his eyes widely. Would this misery last forever? Would she never issue from it? Yet she was as good as all the women who were living happily, She had seen duchesses at Vaubyessard with clumsier waists and commoner ways, and she execrated the injustice of God. She leaned her head against the walls to weep. She envied lives of stir, longed for masked balls, for violent pleasures, with all the wildness that she did not know, but that these must surely yield. She grew pale and suffered from palpitations of the heart. Charles prescribed valerian and camphor baths. Everything that was tried only seemed to irritate her the more. On certain days she chanted with feverish rapidity, and this overexcitement was suddenly followed by a state of torpor, in which she remained without speaking, without moving. What then revived her was pouring a bottle of eau de cologne over her arms. As she was constantly complaining about toast, Charles fancied that her illness was no doubt due to some local cause, and fixing on this idea, began to think seriously of setting up elsewhere. From that moment, she drank vinegar, contracted a sharp little cough, and completely lost her appetite. It cost Charles much to give up toast after living there 4 years, and when he was beginning to get on there, yet, if it must be, he took her to Rouen to see his old master. It was a nervous complaint. Change of air was needed. After looking about him on this side and that, Charles learned that in the Neufchalet arrondissement there was a considerable market town called Yonville-l'Abbaye, whose doctor, a Polish refugee, had decamped a week before. Then he wrote to the chemist of the place to ask the number of the population, the distance from the nearest doctor, what his predecessor had made a year, and so forth. And the answer being satisfactory, he made up his mind to move towards the spring, if Emma's health did not improve. One day, when in view of her departure, she was tidying a drawer, something pricked her finger. It was a wire of her wedding bouquet. The orange blossoms were yellow with dust, and the silver-bordered satin ribbons frayed at the edges. She threw it into the fire. It flared up more quickly than dry straw. Then it was, like a red bush in the cinders, slowly devoured. She watched it burn. The little pasteboard berries burst, the wire twisted, the gold lace melted, and the shriveled paper corollas, fluttering like black butterflies at the back of the stove, at last flew up the chimney. When they left toast at the month of March, Madame Bovary was pregnant. Part 2, Chapter 1. Yonville-l'Abbaye, so called from an old Capuchin abbey, of which not even the ruins remain, is a market town 24 miles from Rouen, between the Abbeville and Beauvais roads, at the foot of a valley watered by the Rieu, a little river that runs into the Adelle after turning 3 water mills near its mouth, where there are a few trout that the lads amuse themselves by fishing for on Sundays. We leave the high road at La Boissière and keep straight on to the top of Lieu Hill, whence the valley is seen. The river that runs through it makes of it, as it were, 2 regions with distinct physiognomies. All on the left is pasture land, all of the right arable. The meadow stretches under a bulge of low hills to join at the back with the pasture land of the Bray country, while on the eastern side the plain, gently rising, broadens out, showing as far as eye can follow its blond cornfields. The water, flowing by the grass, divides with a white line the color of the roads and of the plains, and the country is like a great unfolded mantle with a green velvet cape, bordered with a fringe of silver. Before us, on the verge of the horizon, lie the oaks of the forest of Argyll, with the steeps of the St. Jean hills scarred from top to bottom with red irregular lines. They are rain tracks, and these brick tones standing out in narrow streaks against the grey colour of the mountain are due to the quantity of iron springs that flow beyond in the neighbouring country. Here we are on the confines of Normandy, Picardy, and the Ile-de-France, a bastard land whose language is without accent and its landscape is without character. It is there that they make the worst Neufchâtel cheese of all the arrondissements. And, on the other hand, farming is costly because so much manure is needed to enrich this friable soil full of sand and flints. Up to 1835, there was no practicable road for getting to Yonville, but about this time a crossroad was made, which joins that of Abbeville to that of Amiens, and is occasionally used by the Rouen wagoners on their way to Flanders. Yonville-l'Abbaye has remained stationary in spite of its new outlet. Instead of improving the soil, they persist in keeping up the pasture lands, however depreciated they may be in value, and the lazy borough, growing away from the plain, has naturally spread riverwards. It is seen from afar sprawling along the banks like a cowherd, taking a siesta by the waterside. At the foot of the hill beyond the bridge begins a roadway, planted with young aspens, that leads in a straight line to the first houses in the place. These, fenced in by hedges, are in the middle of the courtyards full of straggling buildings. Wine presses, cart sheds, and distilleries scattered under thick trees, with ladders, poles, or skiths hung onto the branches. The thatched roofs, like fur caps drawn over eyes, reach down over about a third of the low windows, whose coarse convex glasses have knots in the middle like the bottoms of bottles. Against the plaster wall diagonally, crossed by black joists, a meagre pear tree sometimes leans, and the ground floors have at their door a small swing gate to keep out the chicks that come pilfering crumbs of bread steeped in cider on the threshold. But the courtyards grow narrower, the houses closer together, and the fences disappear. A bundle of ferns swings under a window from the end of a broomstick. There is a blacksmith's forge, and then a wheelwright's, with 2 or 3 new carts outside that partly block the way. Then, across an open space appears a white house. Beyond, a grass mound ornamented by a cupid, his finger on his lips. 2 brass vases are at each end of a flight of steps. Stanchions blaze upon the door. It is the notary's house and the finest in the place. The church is on the other side of the street, 20 paces farther down, at the entrance of the square. The little cemetery that surrounds it, closed in by a wall breast high, is so full of graves that the old stones, level with the ground, form a continuous pavement on which the grass of itself has marked out regular green squares. The church was rebuilt during the last years of the reign of Charles X. The wooden roof is beginning to rot from the top, and here and there has black hollows in its blue color. Over the door, where the organ should be, is a loft for the men, with a spiraled staircase that reverberates under their wooden shoes. The daylight coming through the plain glass windows falls obliquely upon the pews ranged along the walls, which are adorned here and there with a straw mat bearing beneath it the words in large letters, Mr. So-and-so's pew. Farther on, at a spot where the building narrows, the confessional forms a pendant to a statuette of the Virgin, clothed in a satin robe, coiffed with a tulle veil sprinkled with silver stars, and with red cheeks like an idol of the Sandwich Isles. And finally, a copy of the Holy Family, presented by the Minister of the Interior, overlooking the high altar, between 4 candlesticks, closes in the perspective. The choir stalls of deal wood have been left unpainted. The market, that is to say, a tiled roof supported by some 20 posts, occupies of itself about half of the public square of Yonville. The town hall, constructed from the designs of a Paris architect, is a sort of Greek temple that forms the corner next to the chemist's shop. On the ground floor are 3 Ionic columns, and on the first floor a semicircular gallery, while the dome that crowns it is occupied by a Gallic cock, resting one foot upon the Charté, and holding in the other the scales of justice. But that which most attracts the eye is opposite the Lion d'Or Inn, the chemist's shop of Monsieur Homais. In the evening especially, its argand lamp is lit up, and the red and green jars that embellish his shop front throw far across the street their 2 streams of color. Then, across them, as if in Bengal lights, is seen the shadow of the chemist leaning over his desk. His house from top to bottom is placarded with inscriptions written in large hand, round hand, printed hand, Vichy, Seltzer, Baresh waters, blood purifiers, Raspail patent medicine, Arabian cahoot, Dorset lozenges, Renault pasté, trusses, baths, hygienic chocolate, etc. And the signboard, which takes up all the breadth of the shop, bears in gold letters, Homais, chemist. Then, at the back of the shop, behind the great scales fixed to the counter, the word laboratory appears on a scroll above a glass door, which about halfway up once more repeats Homais in gold letters on a black ground. Beyond this, there is nothing to see at Yonville. The street, the only one, a gunshot in length and flanked by a few shops on either side, stops short at the turn of the high road. If it is left on the right hand and the foot of the Saint-Jean hills followed, the cemetery is soon reached. At the time of the cholera, in order to enlarge this, a piece of wall was pulled down, and 3 acres of land by its side purchased. But all the new portion is almost tenantless. The tombs, as heretofore, continue to crowd together towards the gate. The keeper, who is at once gravedigger and church beadle, thus making a double profit out of the parish corpses, has taken advantage of the unused plot of ground to plant potatoes there. From year to year, however, his small field grows smaller, and when there is an epidemic, he does not know whether to rejoice at the deaths or regret the burials. "You live on the dead, Lestiboudois," the curé at last said to him one day. This grim remark made him reflect. It checked him for some time. But to this day he carries on the cultivation of his little tubers, and even maintains stoutly that they grow naturally. Since the events about to be narrated, nothing in fact has changed at Yonville. The tin tricolour flag still swings at the top of the church steeple. The 2 chintz streamers still flutter in the wind from the line drapers. The chemist's fetuses, like lumps of white amadou, rot more and more in the turbid alcohol. And above the big door of the inn, The old golden lion, faded by rain, still shows passers-by its poodle mane. On the evening when the Bovarys were to arrive at Yonville, widow Lefrancois, the landlady of this inn, was so very busy that she sweated great drops as she moved her saucepans. Tomorrow was market day. The meat had to be cut beforehand, the fowls drawn, the soup and coffee made. Moreover, she had the boarders' meal to see to, and that of the doctor, his wife, and their servant. The billiard room was echoing with bursts of laughter. 3 millers in the small parlour were calling for brandy. The wood was blazing, the brazen pan was hissing, and on the long kitchen table, amid the quarters of raw mutton, rose piles of plates that rattled with the shaking of the block on which spinach was being chopped. From the poultry yard was heard the screaming of the fowls, whom the servant was chasing in order to wring their necks. A man, slightly marked with smallpox, in green leather slippers, and wearing a velvet cap with a gold tassel, was warming his back at the chimney. His face expressed nothing but self-satisfaction, and he appeared to take life as calmly as the goldfinch suspended over his head in its wicker cage. This was the chemist. "Artemis," shouted the landlady, "chop some wood, fill the water bottles, bring some brandy, look sharp. If only I knew what dessert to offer the guests you are expecting. Good heavens! Those furniture movers are beginning their racket in the billiard room again. And their van has been left before the front door. The hirondelle might run into it when it draws up. Call Polyte and tell him to put it up. Only think, Monsieur Homais, that since morning they have had about 15 games and drunk 8 jars of cider. Why, they'll tear my cloth for me," she went on, looking at them from a distance, her strainer in her hand. "That wouldn't be much of a loss," replied Monsieur Homais. "You would buy another." "But another billiard table?" exclaimed the widow. "Since that one is coming to pieces, Madame Lefrancois, I tell you again, you are doing yourself harm, much harm. And besides, players now want narrow pockets and heavy cues. Hazards aren't played now. Everything's changed. One must keep pace with the times. Just look at Tellier." The hostess reddened with vexation. The chemist went on. "You may say what you like. His table is better than yours. And if one were to think, for example, of getting up a patriotic pool for Poland, or the sufferers from the Lyon floods, it isn't beggars like him that'll frighten us," interrupted the landlady, shrugging her fat shoulders. Come, Monsieur Homais. As long as the Lion d'Or exists, people will come to it. We've feathered our nest. While one of these days you will find the Café Français closed, with a big placard on the shutters. "Change my billiard table?" she went on, speaking to herself. "The table that comes in so handy for folding the washing, and on which, in the hunting season, I have slept 6 visitors, but that dawdler Yver doesn't come. Are you waiting for him for your gentleman's dinner?" "Wait for him? And what about Monsieur Binet? As the clock strikes 6, you'll see him come in, for he hasn't his equal under the sun for punctuality. He must always have a seat in the small parlour. He'd rather die than dine anywhere else. And so squeamish as he is, and so particular about the cider, not like Monsieur Lyon. He sometimes comes at 7, or even past, and he doesn't so much as look at what he eats. Such a nice young man, never speaks a rough word. Well, you see, there's a great difference between an educated man and an old carabinier who is now a tax collector." 6 o'clock struck. Binet came in. He wore a blue frock coat, falling in a straight line around his thin body, and his leather cap, with its lappets knotted over the top of his head with string, showed under the turned-up peak a bald forehead, flattened by the constant wearing of a helmet. He wore a black cloth waistcoat, a hair collar, grey trousers, and, all the year round, well-blacked boots that had two parallel swellings due to the sticking out of his big toes. Another hair stood out from the regular line of fair whiskers, which encircled his jaws, framed after the fashion of a garden border, his long, wan face, whose eyes were small and the nose hooked. Clever at all games of cards, a good hunter, and writing a fine hand, he had at home a lathe, and amused himself by turning napkin rings, with which he filled up his house with the jealousy of an artist and the egotism of a bourgeois. He went to the small parlour, but the 3 millers had to be got out first, and during the whole time necessary for laying the cloth, Binet remained silent in his place near the stove. Then he shut the door and took off his cap in his usual way. "It isn't with saying civil things that he'll wear out his tongue," said the chemist as soon as he was alone with the landlady. "Oh, he never talks more," she replied. "Last week 2 travellers in the cloth line were here, such clever chaps, who told such jokes in the evening that I fairly cried with laughing. And he stood there like a dab fish and never said a word." "Yes," observed the chemist, "no imagination, no sallies, nothing that makes the society man." "Yet they say he has parts," objected the landlady. "Parts," replied Monsieur Homais. "He parts? In his own line it is possible," he added in a calmer tone, and he went on. "Ah, that a merchant who has large connections, a jurisconsult, a doctor, a chemist, should be thus absent-minded, that they should become whimsical, or even peevish, I can understand. Such cases are cited in history. But at least it is because they are thinking of something. Myself, for example, how often has it happened to me to look on the bureau for my pen to write a label, and to find, after all, that I had put it behind my ear." Madame Lefrancois just then went to the door to see if the hirondelles were not coming. She started. A man dressed in black suddenly came into the kitchen. By the last gleam of the twilight one could see that his face was rubicund and his form athletic. "What can I do for you, Monsieur le Curé?" asked the landlady, as she reached down from the chimney one of the copper candlesticks placed with 3 candles in a row. "Will you take something? A thimbleful of cassis? A glass of wine?" The priest declined very politely. He had come for his umbrella, that he had forgotten the other day at the Ornement convent, and after asking Madame Lefrancois to have it sent to him at the presbytery in the evening, he left for the church, from which the angelus was ringing. When the chemist no longer heard the noise of his boots along the square, he thought the priest's behavior just now very unbecoming. This refusal to take any refreshment seemed to him the most odious hypocrisy. All priests tippled on the sly, and were trying to bring back the days of the tithe. The landlady took up the defense of her curé. "Besides, he could double up 4 men like you over his knee. Last year he helped our people to bring in the straw. He carried as many as 6 trusses at once. He is so strong." "Bravo," said the chemist. "Now just send your daughters to confess to fellows with such a temperament. If I were the government, I'd have the priest bled once a month. Yes, Madame Lefrancois, every month a good phlebotomy, in the interest of the police and morals. Oh, be quiet, Monsieur Homais. You are an infidel. You have no religion. The chemist answered, I have a religion. My religion. And I even have more than all these others with their mummeries and their juggling. I adore God. On the contrary, I believe in the Supreme Being, in a Creator, whatever He may be. I care little who has placed us here below to fulfill our duties as citizens and fathers of families. But I don't need to go to church to kiss silver plates and fatten, out of my pocket, a lot of good-for-nothings who live better than we do. For one can know Him as well in a wood, in a field, or even contemplating the eternal vault, like the ancients. My God. Mine is the God of Socrates, of Franklin, of Voltaire, and of Béranger. I am for the profession of faith of the Savoyard Vicar and the immortal principles of 89. And I can't admit of an old boy of a god who takes walks in his garden with a cane in his hand, who lodges his friends in the belly of whales, dies uttering a cry, and rises again at the end of 3 days, things absurd in themselves, and completely opposed, moreover, to all physical laws, which prove to us, by the way, that priests have always wallowed in turbid ignorance, in which they would fain engulf the people with them. He ceased, looking round for an audience, for in his bubbling over the chemist had for a moment fancied himself in the midst of the town council. But the landlady no longer heeded him. She was listening to a distant rolling. One could distinguish the noise of a carriage, mingled with the clattering of loose horseshoes that beat against the ground, and at last the hirondelle stopped at the door. It was a yellow box on 2 large wheels that, reaching to the tilt, prevented travelers from seeing the road and dirtied their shoulders. The small panes of the narrow windows rattled in their sashes when the coach was closed, and retained here and there patches of mud amidst the old layers of dust that not even storms of rain had altogether washed away. It was drawn by 3 horses, the first a leader, and when it came downhill, its bottom jolted against the ground. Some of the inhabitants of Yonville came out into the square. They all spoke at once, asking for news, for explanations, for hampers. Yver did not know whom to answer. It was he who did the errands of the place in town. He went to the shops and brought back rolls of leather for the shoemaker, old iron for the farrier, a barrel of herring for his mistress, caps from the millionaires, locks from the hairdressers, and all along the road, on his return journey, he distributed his parcels, which he threw, standing upright in his seat and shouting at the top of his voice, over the enclosures of the yards. An accident had delayed him. Madame Bovary's greyhound had run across the field. They had whistled for him a quarter of an hour. Yver had even gone back 1.5 miles, expecting every moment to catch sight of her, but it had been necessary to go on. Emma had wept, grown angry. She had accused Charles of this misfortune. Monsieur Leray, a draper, who happened to be in the coach with her, had tried to console her by a number of examples of lost dogs, recognizing the masters at the end of long years. One, he said, had been told off, who had come back to Paris from Constantinople. Another, gone 150 miles in a straight line and swum 4 rivers. And his own father had possessed a poodle which, after 12 years of absence, had all of a sudden jumped on his back in the street as he was going to dine in town.